All right, we're here to talk about Memoir comics. It's pretty safe to say that most of us creators put moments of our daily life into our work. Whether it's a crazy uncle, you know, a wacky cat we have, something happens at the grocery store, it's going to end up in our work somewhere. Whether our work is fiction, nonfiction, whether it's, you know, on another planet, whether it's right next door, here in town, our work reflects who we are and, of course, our experiences. But Memoir comics takes that one step further. It's much more personal. It's first person point of view. It's nonfiction, and it's usually revolving turnkey moments in our life, defining moments, things that affect us and make us who we are, really. Let's see if this works. So this is just a standard comic strip I've done. Day at the beach, true life experience. Not exactly memoir, kind of. But, you know, this is an example of how our work affects us. I got the worst sunburn in my life last year, so of course I had to write about it. But then my daughter was born premature, and it was a really close call. Horrible experience as a parent to be in a hospital and to have your daughter taken away from you the moment she's born, not being able to see her, not being able to hold her, and then to have 2 weeks touch and go, not sure if she's going to be okay. It's a moment where you freeze. As you can see me in the corner there, it's true life experience, nonfiction, really happened, and it's something that stays with you. And as a creator, you just got to put it out somehow, whether it's for other people or just for yourself. And that's the first thing I'm going to ask these guys after I introduce them, is we all create characters for commercial use. I mean, we want to sell our stuff because we want to do this stuff for a living. We enjoy being creators. But the personal stuff, I think, is more like therapy. I don't know how the rest of them feel, so I'm going to bring that out. We have a very diverse group of people here. Well, we need a lady, but you want to volunteer? I wish we had a little larger group, but this is a great group of guys. They have a wide range of talents, and I'm willing to introduce them now. One at a time. Tom, you want to start? Tell us about how you got into comics and why you're doing Memoir comics and how you feel about it.
Well, I've been doing comics for more than 20 years, I think, at this point, and I've done mostly mini comics, and almost entirely from invented characters. Cartoony characters, very influenced by Charles Schulz. Little puppets, basically. And that's always been satisfying to me. I've done longer stories, I've done smaller comic strips, all sorts of things, but always inventing characters and inventing stories. Always with a sort of emotional integrity, always emotionally sort of about me, but everything else heightened or exaggerated or altered so that it was more playful. And I only recently started doing Memoir comics when my daughter died, and I really had no way to process it. I don't know if we should have started with me, but it'll only get happier after me.
Unfortunately, we did hypothetical work. I really can't tell you how much I feel.
No, it's fine. But having done comics for so long and it being my main way of processing the world, I found myself just scribbling frantically to try and sort of figure out anything, figure out what to do, how the world works, what happened, all sorts of stuff, emotionally what was going on. And so I started doing a memoir comic about that. And it's also actually maybe because I think things through too much, or maybe because I'm a teacher, or maybe because the event was so intense, the story has also become how to depict the story as well as just the story. So it's got this second level where I'm trying to figure out, and it actually only comes through a little bit in issue 2, and as it goes, I've got a lot planned out. A lot of it is like, how would you depict this in comics or in this words and pictures combination, etc. So that's where I'm from.
We'll talk more about all this. Chris, you want to?
Well, what got me into comics, I was completely uninterested in making journal comics or memoir comics of any kind, really. just wanted to write stories, make people laugh, and I think that I came to making journal comics from my friend Jed Collins, just constantly telling me about how much he loved James Kochalka, so I finally checked him out. And I liked it, and I wasn't just ready to jump into it. So actually what got me into it with this book here, I decided to start doing it just so that I could learn how to draw myself and my family. So, you know, along with getting information in this book, you're seeing the progression of the characters. And I started it really raw. I didn't even try. I just scribbled glasses in a face and started from there. And it pretty much gets developed by the end to what it is today, but not quite. But as I was doing it, just like you're saying, you know, with the therapy, I found that I was really starting to get to know things about myself because I was examining myself in a different way. And so I've kept doing it. And this one just is a whole package of everything. At this point, there's this webcomic, and then I have another webcomic that is a little more refined, and I have split custody with my daughter. These ones are about her and I when I'm with her, and the other ones I make just about my life when she's at her mom's, and they're more adult themed, which is the main reason why I split them, because I felt weird combining certain kinds of subject matter.
They are very different comics.
Yes.
I had a hard time choosing which side to go, but since the other one had bad words, I
Yes.
went this way. Okay, anything else at the moment, or come back?
I think that's good for them.
Okay. Dara.
All right. My name's Dara Naraghi. I've probably done the least amount out of this whole panel here in terms of memoir, autobiographical stuff. There's 3 or 4 short stories that I've done that are just pure autobiographical. I got my start in comics just, making mini comics with a bunch of other folks that I know here in Columbus. And then we ended up kind of forming a collective, and then we started publishing our own small press anthology called Panel. So I did a lot of work with them, and it was in all sorts of genres because we would pick different themes for the books. And I had a lot of fun just, trying my hand at everything. And then I did a webcomic that was a bunch of short slice of life stories. But none of them, still at that point, I didn't really feel comfortable bringing any of my experiences into it. They may have kind of informed it a little bit, but again, I just wanted to try my hand at different things. And that sort of led into some work for hire stuff, so I did a lot of, genre stuff, which was all fun. But after a while, I kind of got tired of that, and I kind of felt like, well, I wanted to, now that I felt like I kind of knew what I was doing in terms of writing, I wanted to bring some more personal stuff into it. So this is a short story that I did that was in Dark Horse Presents, and it was just about growing up in Iran after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And I followed it up with another one, again in Dark Horse Presents, and then I had a short story in the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund anthology. And that one, again, had to do with something that happened that I, remembered vividly from when I was a kid growing up in Iran. And it sort of fit in with their theme of, censorship, anti-censorship. So that's been mostly, my experiences is doing those kind of short stories. And I just kind of, I don't know, there's a wide variety of autobio comics that I like, but I never really thought that maybe the kind of stuff that I'd experienced would be that interesting for other people to read. So I just kind of wanted to pick and choose maybe a few short, small incidents that, in my mind at least, I was hoping that people would find interesting. And then what I'm doing now is actually a graphic novel that's going to come out in about a month from NPM called Persia Blues. And this is definitely not autobiographical, but it is something where I'm trying to bring more of my experiences that you were talking about, and people that family members, my parents, and sort of my extended family, a lot of their traits and a lot of the stuff that they went through during that time, I kind of bring in and just, merge them into characters in the book. So I would say it's sort of informed by it, but it's definitely not, memoir in any sense.
You brought up some really good points that I come back to and address the entire panel. Let's finish introductions. John Porcellino, right?
Yeah.
Porcellino. Did I say it right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't you talk to us about yourself?
Well, my name's John. I do a comic called King Cat, and which I would agree with you to show you, but you can go to my table and see it. And I've been doing that coming up on 25 years. So at this point, you know, over half my life has been documented in King Cat. When I started doing this title, it was a mixture of autobiographical stuff, like slice of life stuff, and probably semi-fictional stuff and just absurd kind of stories that I came up with. And over the years, it kind of became more and more strictly autobiographical. It's probably 99.987% autobiographical.
Sure about the 7?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, yeah. You know, you mentioned earlier about these kind of turning points or these things, and I just was always really interested in real life, and like the simple fact of being alive always seemed very powerful to me in a mysterious way that I could never quite put my finger on. And so in my art of whatever type, I was always trying to kind of investigate that feeling. And so I think that's what led me to really think about my life and to process it through art. But I became very interested, you know, I certainly write about like really extreme turning point kind of powerful moments in my work, but I also am very interested in writing about very simple kind of mundane events. I'm particularly interested in documenting like experiences that we have in our lives that are so mundane that we probably oftentimes don't even notice them happening. But as a person who's interested in like this feeling of being alive, I realize that most of our life is spent in these kind of moments, making breakfast or whatever. And what I found was that same kind of mysterious feeling was present in all these moments, no matter how seemingly simple or insignificant they were. And so that was really interesting to me, and that kind of became a focus for me of you know, a willingness kind of to write about things that didn't seem noteworthy.
It's pretty interesting, though, but to take where memoir, standard memoir would focus on those defining moments, you're looking at the moments around them because they actually are more present. The defining moments, you might have 1, 2, 3 in your life, or maybe in a decade, where the daily moments, they're always there. And like you said, some people just make life right through them because they're just, you know, routine. But it's interesting to take those moments apart because they're often introspective, but you may just not even realize it.
Yeah, and I mean, I have written about like these really profound, intense moments in my life as well, but I also want to give a similar, you know, attention to
That's
others.
really interesting. Now we have Nate, who, you've done your own work, but you also draw other people's memoir work, which I find will bring a good twist to this panel, because how does it feel to do other people's work as well as your own? And you said this was your wife's story, so that's going to be really interesting. I want to hear about this.
So yeah, basically my name's Nate. I'm from Arkansas, but I live in Bloomington, Indiana. I've been publishing comics for about 20 years, and my relationship to memoir comics, yeah, I guess it's twofold here. A lot of my work from the late 90s into maybe 2005 was closer to what I would roughly call some kind of half fiction. And a lot of that was because most of my best friends are the friends I've had since I was 12. Basically, we started a band together and started touring a lot and sharing a lot of very powerful experiences together. So we've developed this shared first-person narrative for a lot of our lives. And, you know, when I was about 20, I began making comics again instead of writing zines about these experiences. And I didn't really read enough books at the time. I wasn't thinking like a writer, though I was interested in writing fiction. So I found myself spending a lot of time transposing and recontextualizing the people in my life and the experiences in my life and shuffling them so that they became a thinly veiled work of fiction. And a lot of those stories I was very happy with. I was growing and changing as a result. And at a certain point, it just kind of hit me that these weren't my experiences. These also belong to other people who might have wildly differing views on something that's that close to their lives. So I basically put the brakes on for a while. I stopped drawing comics, except I drew a 4-chapter autobiographical comics essay called Please Release. That is the closest thing I've done to a first-person memoir comic. And from there, I sort of rebooted and started writing fiction, but still sort of refining this sort of half-fiction, non-technique. So my 2 graphic novels that I wrote and drew, both, the first one was Swallow Me Whole, and there are elements from my life, though it's clearly a work of fiction, but there's a grandmother character in this book whose, I think every line of dialogue from the grandmother's character is straight out of my grandmother's life from the last few months of her being alive, when she's having these very powerful delusions as a result of cancer treatment drugs. In the Empire is still a work of fiction, but it's much more a memoir about growing up in a culture of violence, in a relatively privileged first world environment, in the Reagan era, in a Southern military family, and the relationship amongst all those things. So that's what's going on with my own books, but at the same time, I mostly do memoir comics that other people have written. And it began with this book called The Silence of Our Friends, which is a 95% autobiographical tale about Mark Long's life as a kid growing up in Houston, Texas in the mid-late 1960s. And I feel like this book and my work on this short story called Cakewalk with my wife Rachel about her experiences making a very ignorant Halloween costume choice in 5th grade while growing up in a really culturally homogenous region in northwestern Indiana really kind of sold me on the idea, or I guess on my role as a visual artist working with other people to help them tell their stories, and sort of clarified my role as a visual storyteller as in terms of channeling out certain kinds of information and knowing where to and where not to inject my own creativity into someone else's narrative. And I guess the thing I'm working on right now is I have one book done with a graphic novel trilogy called March, which is the autobiography of civil rights icon and Congressman John Lewis, who was the first chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He's the only living speaker remaining from the March on Washington, and just a great human being. But it's been a very powerful and challenging experience to try to, translate a lot of the script he's worked up with his co-writer into a comics form that is both very intimate and is also informative and objective in as many ways as possible.
Thank you. All right, now putting together what we've just talked about, I personally want to know the answer to some of these questions. Like, both Dara and they were talking. This is very personal work. We're putting it out there where other people are seeing it. How has the response been? Do you find people are like not happy with what you're saying? Especially like, for me, I do mostly harmless stuff. I've done comic strips most of my life. I did something semi-autobiographical, and my wife gets a lot of flack for some of the things I put in there from her family and her relatives. Even I've gotten a lot of flack from things I've said, because I'm telling it from my point of view. This is my viewpoint, but other people see things very personally, very different. So I'm going to address, I don't know how we can do this. We can do one at a time, or whoever wants to raise a hand, but how has the response been? Has it been mostly positive? How do you deal with the negative? And is there anything you regret putting out there for the world to see? Does anybody want to start us off with any of those subjects?
Yeah, I can go, because I think my answer will be fairly short.
Okay.
I tend to be, I'm fairly private with my private life, and I don't like to share it too much. So the stuff that I did write about mainly just involved me. And if it did involve other people, it's people that are not here, So I felt confident and okay with that just because I don't really, maybe I don't have the courage to go that extra step and put out some more personal stuff, but at the same time I also don't want to put my parents or people that I know in a position where they may not like it.
Right.
And that's not to make a comment on anyone else that's doing this stuff, it's just for me. So for my stuff, like I said, I picked incidents that I thought might be, as a whole, that the story as a whole might be interesting to people, but it's not necessarily something that somebody might take offense to or whatever. And the response has been good, and I think a lot of it too is just the subject matter. It's something that maybe most people aren't familiar with or hadn't seen. The story that I did for the CBLDF book was when I was in 5th grade. My principal pulled me out of class one day and he said, "Hey, I know you're really good friends with this one boy, and his family, they're not Muslim, they're Baha'i, which at that time in Iran with the Islamic government, that was not a religion that they recognized, and they would persecute those people." And so he's like, "I know you're a really good student, and just because I did well in my religion class, you just assumed that I was a good Muslim." And he's like, I want you to talk to your friend and convert him." And as a kid in 5th grade, like that kind of pressure or whatever, I had no idea how to deal with it. Like, I didn't know what to do. So that's what I wrote about, in this story. And I think it was a lot of, like I said, people's reaction was fairly positive because they could, even if they never experienced that, they could kind of in their mind try to relate to, how the heck would I do that, at that age, what would I do? So, I guess that's mostly it.
I have a kind of a strange way with the two comics. And at first, people often were very happy to be included in the comics. At this point, my daughter's mother has asked me to no longer be in the comics, which I have no problem with respecting. But what's difficult about that is that, we still get along fine, and we still have experiences. And my daughter is there, and there are things, and this is like a completely blocked off part of my life that I can't write. And it is my life too, but it is now blocked off. And like I said, I have no problem with it and no resentment. But it's strange to be completely uninhibited and then have this one little thing. And it's kind of interesting. I try to use it to my advantage. I try to, get something positive out of it, which I have. But one strange thing is the other comic that I make, not about my daughter. It gets to be very lewd sometimes. It's very honest, and I'm talking about things in it that most people will not even talk to people about. And if you read the comic, you would think that I am like extremely enthusiastic about it. But in reality, I'm still weighing it out and debating whether I'm even doing the right thing by making these comics. And they're going to end on my birthday in May, so it's almost over, and I'm very relieved, kind of. Because sometimes I find myself reaching even further for something shocking, maybe, and I don't want to do that. That's where it becomes dishonest in a way, because for a while it was just very relaxed and it was just coming out, and I don't reach for things and use them. I just sit there and rack my mind, and I will give in and just make a mundane comic that doesn't really meet the standards that I'm looking for. But it's hard. It's a hard thought process, and I believe that I have lost some readership because of that comic, and that's part of what I have to accept, I guess.
Do you think you're driving the creativity instead of letting the creativity drive the strip? Is that what you're saying? Like you're forcing it, you think? Or?
I fall into that mindset. Okay. I think that for the most part, I don't, but sometimes, usually it's kind of effortless. Usually, I just, if there's something that happened that is in my mind or something that I thought that is going to be the comic. But on days where I don't know what to write, that's when I do that.
I read one example where you said, "I'm so tired I can't think straight. Maybe I should write a strip about being so tired that I can't think straight." good night. You
Yeah,
know?
and
I actually like that one.
And that's cool that you like that. I'm really upset with myself when I make comics like that. Because I try as much as possible to not make comics about making comics in
Right.
them. But I feel like to not have that in there every now and then, especially when it's on my mind, is also dishonest. So,
Now, do you have a deadline? Is that the problem? Because I know a lot of people, you set yourself a deadline. It doesn't matter about the rest of the world, but you feel I have to do a strip on Wednesday, and that, you know, if you don't have an idea for Wednesday, then
well, I have one for every day. And
okay.
the ones about my daughter, I don't pencil. I just go straight to ink. So I do those as the days go. And with the other one, I try to have them. They absolutely have to be at least written that day before I go to bed. I like to have them penciled, but I've been a little behind on those ones for a little while because of this 29-page day that I did
Right.
here of my baby being born, and I'm just now finally starting to get caught up again.
Okay. Does anybody else want to discuss the subject of putting yourself out there? Reception, regrets?
I can say something.
I mean, I could say, did somebody else jump in?
I'll after you.
I probably don't have much to add to it. I mean, I guess I've never looked at my comics as like I never have tried to use them for like revenge purposes or you know
I didn't even think of that.
to unload on someone in particular or anything like that. So I think mostly the response has been pretty good, and you know I've been doing it long enough that I think the people around me kind of realize that I'm an autobiographical cartoonist. So like sometimes I kind of look at it like if you're there, you're fair game a little bit. But one thing I was going to add that Nate brought up earlier was this idea of like you've got this individual story, but there's these other people around you, and like you know they've got their own story about the same events. And I was doing a book called Perfect Example a while back, and it was my first attempt at doing like a very long, like a sustained kind of narrative, and it was from something that had happened, you know, several years, 10 years or so earlier. So I actually got in touch with a lot of people who were around and just kind of said, I'm doing this book about the summer of 1986, and like I got in touch with them mostly to like clarify things. Like I'd say, hey, remember that one night we like drove to you know, Evanston or whatever? Like, what do you remember? Like I remember like this happened, but I'm not sure. And I would try to get some feedback from people on that. And I very quickly realized that I remember things oftentimes very differently than the other people that were there. And in a weird way, it kind of liberated me a little bit, because up to that time, I don't think my stuff was really journalistic or whatever, but I did kind of pride myself on it being as straightforward and truthful as possible. And the experience of working on that book and talking to all these people, and once I started realizing that was really interesting, I actually kind of interviewed a lot of these people from my past. You know, like, you know, I wanted to hear their versions of events before I even like, you know, put my version of things out there to them. And so what it did was it made me really realize that like I'm writing this story of my life. And like if somebody else wrote that story, it would be different.
It would be their story.
Yes, and I guess I also realized, like, you know, 10 years on, I had these stories in my head of the way certain things happen. And the story that was in my head, even if it wasn't perfectly factually accurate, is still the story that was in my head. It was the way I defined that experience and the way I recognized it and the way I expressed it to myself. And I felt like that had a certain value too. So doing that book kind of, I mean, even now when I do, you know, especially longer stories involve a lot of people, I give myself a certain leeway. You know, maybe it's not like perfectly journalistically truthful, in that I may compress certain events or rearrange the order of things, or, you know, delete certain sections or whatever. I don't make up whole sections, but I will edit and arrange these kind of experiences in a way that is kind of truthful to the story, that I'm telling, because I want the story to be truthful and accurate, but I also want it to be a well-constructed story. And so, just that experience gave me a little bit of relief from feeling like I have to be bound by this kind of tight, so-called truthfulness, because, it's like a cliche to say, but all our truths are really relative, So it felt it's easier to focus on, okay, this is my truth of what happened. I don't want to mislead people or be inaccurate, but I also want to be true to this kind of story that is come from within.
You bring up a really good point. I think as writers, creators, we do have an automatic self-editing process that develops as we develop as creators. I mean, something happens, you're right away thinking about it in terms of, like you said, editing it for, making it more interesting. You're not taking away the truth. What you're doing is you're presenting the truth in a better format that's going to be more accessible to a reader. And I find myself doing the same exact thing. You start not rearranging things, but it's just like, how
do I tell this story?
Start thinking in your mind, how can I tell the story?
Doing things perfectly chronologically from A to Z the way they happen to you is the way they happen to you, but it's not necessarily the best way to express that experience.
Right. Probably do
just a couple things that might be relevant to this. In the middle of the tragedy I was undergoing, I also had this banal experience, an infuriating experience, trying to sell this co-op apartment. It was a large reason of my moving away from New York City. Anyway, we, just to get the dates quickly down, in April we had finally found, in April we had found a buyer for it at this price. We negotiated, they loved the house, whatever. And we did all that planning ahead of time so that we could get out by September, because it takes a while for a house or an apartment to sell. And so in April we had this handshake deal, and all that had to happen was that this co-op board had to approve the paperwork, and then everything would go. And so that was like 4 or 5 months, and we assumed everything was fine. And what started to happen was that we started getting these calls from one member of the board who was comfortable enough talking to us, telling us, but she wouldn't tell us everything, but she was telling us that the sale wouldn't go through. We're like, what are you talking about? What are they, like Al-Qaeda? What's the problem? And she's like, well, I can't tell you. And then it got and she came out a little more and told us a little bit more. She's like, well, there are certain reasons. And then finally, it came out that our for sale price was too low, and the co-op board wasn't going to approve our sale because the price was too low and it's going to reflect badly on everybody else, even though it was perfectly good for our circumstances. And anyway, this all happened around the time before and after my daughter died, and it was about the most infuriating thing I've ever experienced. And the circumstances made everything much more amplified, so my hatred for the situation became extreme. And so that's actually the oddest thing that I've been wrestling with, is how much of that stuff to put into the book. A little bit. And I mean, there were issues like we toyed with the idea of suing them, they toyed with the idea of suing us, and all sorts of stuff. And particularly the friend who actually went out of her way to call us and say, listen, Peter doesn't want to be talking to you, but I'm so absolutely infuriated with that situation and horrified by everything else that it's all going in there. I'm not going to name names or anything. But so that's sort of one thing I've wrestled with, which is like how much of that. And it's so banal, it's administrative, it's all about money, it's stupid. So I'm putting that stuff in. But the other thing is that I've never done memoir comics or autobiography. And early on in this book, in issue 1, I talked about how utterly broke we were. I mean, mind-boggling, damagingly broke. And I've had a couple people since talk to me about that more than the rest of the book. Like, suddenly I'm having conversations about money with people and saying, it's really brave of you to write that. I'm like, hey, thanks. I was just, anyway, so that's been kind of fun too.
Well, it's going to say. Just went around my head. No, it's eliminated. I'll come back to
I mean, a lot of what I had to say has been covered in other
Okay.
ways. I mean, I guess in terms of craft, like John was saying, one of the things I learned in the process of doing Silence or Friends and Cakewalk simply had to do with precisely what you were saying. Like, basically, Mark and Jim, when writing the script for Silence or Friends, which was movie style, it was a movie style script, so it's already sort of divorced from a classic prose version of someone's life. But then, tweaks I would make all were structural changes that were in service of the fact that we were making a product out of an experience. And the word product, it's a very crass sounding term when you're dealing with creative work. You're making the object that will come of the experience. And with Rachel's story, Cakewalk, the content is entirely true, but a lot of it had to do with really a lot of it was growing up in this incredibly incredibly sheltered and homogenous, fear-laden, white bread culture. And so a lot of it's more than this one experience of dressing up as Aunt Jemima for Halloween and no adult giving her an appropriate response to let her know why it's not okay or even that it isn't okay. A lot of it had to do, it could almost extend infinitely to the entire cultural experience of growing up in northwestern Indiana. And so a lot of it was the task that we tackled together of where do you actually start the story with panel one, and where do you control time? Where do you start building a story structure out of your experience? And yet, at that point, it's not an account. It's not an account of your life. You're making a story out of the account. And I feel like as I go back and work on my own books that have become more and more fictional over time, it's been very valuable to sort of work through that process with someone else's story from their lives, so that I can then sort of transpose this mode of thinking, this way of looking at narrative, whether it's from my own life or just out of my head, and sort of seeing it for the creative and structural tool that it is.
Yeah, let me go back to what Tom was saying. I couldn't find the words, but I think we're all kind of mentioning the same thing, that I think there's a certain bravery. I'm not as brave as any of these guys. I mean, I think they're very brave to put what they're saying out on paper and on the internet and in front of people. But it's also funny that everyone's saying, well, this is my story. I don't know if anybody else is interested in it. But obviously we are interested because we're here and we've read your stuff. And I just find the dichotomy kind of interesting that, some of us aren't sure how it's gonna be, but we feel, and we have a story to tell. We need to tell that story. And as creators, and we've already put our work out there, we're going to put our personal stories out there. And I think it takes a tremendous amount of bravery. I mean, each one of us has had different levels of well, I'm not sure how much to put it out. Should I put it out? Is anybody going to be interested? Is it, too personal? How are other people going to react? I just want to applaud everybody here in the panel for doing some, great work and being brave enough to tell your stories in a personal way and sharing them. How are we doing on time?
It's 20 minutes.
20 minutes? Oh, okay.
I was going to say, well,
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say about that. I certainly have, at some point after doing these comics about myself for 25 years, you really do wonder, just how many times am I going to draw this little John King face again? It's a little disgusting, And I did struggle with that, for a period. And again, my comics are, I think they're good comics. I don't think they're boring or maybe they are. I am kind of interested in boring things, so they might be boring to a certain extent. But I felt like I had to at some point just trust the fact this is what I do. I don't feel like I chose to do autobiographical comics. I think this was just the natural path that my art took. And to trust that fact and to trust the method that I use to express myself. And I mean, the idea of like, okay, I've got this story from my life and I want to write about it, and the question of, are people going to find this interesting? Like, what's the value in this? I mean, I get asked that question all the time, and I honestly don't know how to answer it.
Right.
I think that there's like a universality in our experience as human beings that can be put across through an individual's depiction of their life experiences, and I think that that's what the reader picks up on that draws them to this work. And there are plenty of autobiographical comics that I think, for some reason, don't make that connection necessarily, and I'm never honestly quite sure what that is, and it's always a threat that like I'm going to fall on the wrong side of that thing. But I do try to just trust my intuition and kind of but it is a little bit difficult at times to have the nerve to do it. But I guess after all these years, I just I feel like this is what I do, and if it needs to change, it will change. But I just kind of trust that process. I'm particularly interested in other people's stories, and I also that helps me trust that as well. Like the comics that I respond to the most are usually autobiographical, or at least sourced in autobiography.
Right.
Most of the prose books I read are biography or autobiography or essays and things. So I guess I trust that if I find those other people's lives interesting enough to invest in, that maybe it's not such a maybe it's okay for me to put some of this stuff out there and hope that it reaches somebody who needs to reach.
That trust is something important, man. As creators, I know for myself, I'm assuming the rest of us here, there is a voice in our head that says, I want to tell the story. And sometimes you're like, well, gosh, I got work to do. I got to pay the bills. What is the commercial value of this idea? And I've found that by trusting that instinct, there's been a few things I've done. I'm like, nobody's going to care about this but me, but I'm going to do it because there's this nagging voice in my head. And I've actually gotten the most response.
Yes, it's funny how that happens. I was going to say that as well. Like, oftentimes I'll be on the fence with a story or something, and I'd be like second guessing it or this or that after the fact. And, I've learned to kind of lean towards that initial impulse as far as letting something out, and it is eerie almost how like those stories that I really question or whatever. I'll get a new issue will come out, and I'll get some feedback. People will be like, that one story about the, whatever, raccoon. That was so awesome. Like, I remember this one time or whatever. And it's always those stories that, like, I'm really hesitant about. And, like, that's another trust thing where, like, it's like, you know what? I felt, like, drawn to do this, and I hope there's a reason for it out there in the universe, and I hope that like the person who needs to read the raccoon comic finds it, and then it's all worth it. Like honestly, if it's like even if it's just that one person who writes or emails or whatever and says like, that story really touched me, or I laughed, or any kind of thing like that, I feel like okay, well it served its purpose.
What I personally think is, and then everybody else is welcome to join in. I think if there's a passion burning to force you to tell that story, even though you may not think you have the time, the energy, the need, but that passion's in you, and it'll haunt you until you put that thing down. I think that's the passion that people are relating to. Because if you feel that strongly about something, your audience is going to, I guess, pick up on that in some way.
I wanted to address the critical voice that you were just bringing up, the questioning voice that I think is sort of essential when you're tackling something that is autobiographical. It's like, with anything that we do, this voice will come up from time to time about appropriateness or about the kinds of, the kinds of perspective or power at play, or whether it's even working, whether it's boring or annoying. But I think that the questioning voice, the fact that it emerges, is generally a promising sign simply because it indicates that one has not yet gone over the waterfall of narcissism, you know, where like you're not eternally justified within yourself that your experiences are worth putting to paper. So, you know, sometimes things don't make the cut. The fact that the voice exists, I think, is very important. Like, I guess another one of my pointless punk analogies is that I grew up in a certain era of underground punk music that, you know, from the late 80s to the mid 90s was a wave of punk that was becoming increasingly personal and introverted and dealt a lot with emotions and a lot with relationships, and was leaning away at the time from politics and from explicit concrete things. And as I was getting into writing and drawing my own comics, I was very much coming from this musical perspective where, you know, it's thrilling as a teenager to be able to yell and jump around and sing about your feelings and your experiences, and all of a sudden it's done. Not that anyone can hear what you're saying or respond to it in that way, but with comics, you know, with the growth and the change that's happened in the comics field in America in the last 10 years, it's true that, you know, like with underground music, you know, singing, writing, drawing about yourself not only is a great entry point, it's the most accessible, but in a lot of ways will, you know, can definitely get the strongest reaction. But at the same time, I feel like understanding the kind of perspective that you're espousing, understanding the kind of stories that you're interested in by exploring your own experiences like this sort of helps you know when is enough and when to start working on fiction, or when to start crafting the story end of autobiographical stories. So I know there's definitely, I feel like, you know, with social media, with an increasingly narcissistic and solipsistic culture, it's been very interesting, like in the last 5 years, to see not only an explosion on all fronts of, you know, of personal narratives and autobiographical comics, but also to see what's going to happen in the next 5 years as our world continues to get more narcissistic, more interconnected.
Like me.
Okay, this is semi on that track, but I wanted to just thought about it. It might be interesting, but like, I mean, when I was talking about trust and stuff, it occurred to me that I also have situations where, and I mentioned earlier, like I like boring things. So like, there are times in my comics where I will have that impulse or that passion for doing a certain story, a certain script, and I will really kind of feel like this is kind of over that edge. Like this is like nobody's gonna get this. And but I also kind of trust that impulse as well, of like, you know what, like, this feels right to me, and it might not necessarily feel right to anybody else. But like, as an artist, I have to be true to that voice. And I don't want to be totally self-indulgent, and I don't want to be totally solipsistic and weird. You can go over that edge, right? But at the same time, as an artist, I think you have a responsibility to your own personal self to sometimes let some of that stuff through. And sometimes once you let that guard down, it can take you to pretty interesting places. So like, you know, I don't want to sound both sides of the story, but I think it's true. You do kind of walk a certain weird line that you can't always necessarily explain or understand. And I over the years, I've learned to tend to follow that impulse, you know, and in a thoughtful way, like Nate was saying, not just blindly, like whatever I do is great. But there are certain times that I think, as well as really considering the audience and like, okay, how do I need to craft this for a reader and this and that. I think there are other instances where, as an artist, you just need to go someplace that you kind of don't know where it's going, and you kind of don't. I mean, you can even fail, you know. But I think that's important to allow yourself that from time to time, at the very least, when it is this kind of compelling inner thing that just needs to come out.
Sometimes if you go too far, it'll bring you back and ground you,
Oh, sure, yeah. So it's tricky walking that line. I was going to say with Nate too, like I think all writers have that tendency, that self-critical thing of like, okay, where am I going? Why am I doing this? And as an autobiographical cartoonist, it's almost like a little more personal. It's not like why am I telling this story as a fictional story or whatever? Because it's like, I'm talking about myself. Like there's a certain level there where I can become really squeamish, And so I think the important thing is just to, like Nate said, to be thoughtful about what you're doing. I think that's the most important thing. Be thoughtful about what you're doing and consider what you're doing and why and how you're doing it. And I think that eventually will lead you to grow as an artist and a storyteller and learn how you want to do things and why you want to do them and all that good stuff.
I think that honesty in your delivery too is very important in relating to people, like you're talking how we all are a person, we all can be related to, and I just think that honesty is important in the delivery. And that's why somebody like Jeffrey Brown has such a massive readership. He's very honest. He's seems to be unbiased through it for the most part. Isn't really like trying to make himself look great. And I think that when you're honest and it is real life rather than this adjusted event, that people, without even really knowing that they're getting the honest truth, feel that. And I think that that's an important thing. And of course, being able to write good and have it flow, but I think
honesty helps cross that. I mean, no matter how you're writing, if you are honest, people are going to, I think, pick up on that, where they're not going to want to be BS'd. Can I go to the audience at this point? I apologize, we're running low on time, but I do want to hear what the audience has to say. Any questions? Can you address to anybody in particular?
Yeah, I have a question. In general, as you're writing your autobiographical comics, how do you deal with, you talk about the importance of honesty, but how do you deal with portraying yourself when yourself is in not that good a light? When you've done bad things or you've done stupid things, nobody can be the hero of their own life throughout the entirety, I guess is what I'm saying. So how do you deal with portraying that and putting that part of your life out there?
I was just going to say it helps us behave. Go on.
I hadn't thought about that.
If it's if you
moral
already
compass built in.
If you already feel that way and you're motivated enough to depict it, I feel like it sort of helps you understand the size and shape of whether it's your embarrassment, your remorse, and it's not necessarily that it functions as therapy, but if you're already living those feelings that make you ashamed of a situation in which you weren't depicted in the best light, I feel like you don't even have to really justify yourself, in the comic or try to dig out of the hole or anything.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's in some ways it's a way of taking responsibility, but in other ways, I guess it sort of underlines the fact that you're already dealing with it in real life and are facing some form of consequence, whether it's internal or external.
And if you want to portray a particular instance in your life in that way, you have to choose. Is it going to be memoir? Am I going to be totally honest and say, oh yeah, I did this? Or are you going to put it into a fictional character? And that's one way to deal with it, is put it into a fictional character so you can separate yourself from what's happening and examine it from the outside. That's a choice we all make when we decide to tell a story. Is it going to be memoir, or is it going to be, fictional, where we can examine it from a different viewpoint?
And I also think, I consider, when things like that happen, I consider, is this comic going to be able to help somebody with a similar situation or a similar thought process or choice? And if it will help somebody, I will do it, no matter how embarrassing it is to me. And if it won't help somebody, if I see that it might not really help somebody, then I'm kind of just like, maybe I won't embarrass myself this time. But also, if I think it'll make somebody laugh, then again.
I also feel like you can fall into the trap of like being totally, like self-loathing and all that stuff, and then that gets a little bit tiresome for people after a while too. But I will always err on the side of making myself look bad than making myself look good. It's a safer bet to make yourself look bad. To be honest about that than to write some talk about, I'm the greatest guy in the world. I helped this old lady across the street because that's just the kind of guy I am. Like, nobody wants to read that, right?
Yeah, a few nice stories out there,
Yeah, I mean, but you know what I'm saying.
So we might have time for one quick question. Anybody else want to?
So,
Yeah, you got it.
so Nate, were you saying that if you feel like something, no matter how squeamish it makes you as a creator, if it's so profound that you are that scared about it, that you should?
No. And I think maybe that's a very good question in the context of this over-confessional culture, media culture that we're very much intertwined in, that most of us are, including me. And basically, I feel like the simple answer is definitely no. But I feel like if it's something that makes you that uncomfortable, it's obviously powerful, and you're obviously already thinking about it because of some transformative quality, a value that you definitely see in it. But I think going back to what you were saying, it might go back to is this better served under the guise of another kind of narrative? And I think a lot of times that helps remove. It's not just sting, but if you're dealing with something truly awful, it's a very important question to be like, is this a truth better served in fiction? Simply no. But
you may just not be ready to tell that story yet. If you're that uncomfortable, let it gel. The subconscious mind's going to tell you what to do eventually. It's going to come out.
I mean, I've just kind of recently started to come to terms with the idea that there are certain stories that are really, experiences, I should say, that are really important to me and life-changing, and that I will not be telling, just because, I can go through that process of dealing with that on my own without necessarily having to put this out in a more public forum. That I guess I am very concerned about the way people. Like I said, I don't want to hurt people or make people paint people in a bad light or whatever. And
I don't think that's our job, right?
I mean, for me personally, I've started to realize that there are certain things in my life that I can deal with and I can process without having to put them through the filter of comics. And it's a weird kind of feeling because I've become dependent in a lot of ways on using comics as that process. But I think that's okay. Like, we're human beings, and you got to make that decision in human terms.
I wish we had a lot more time because this has been really fascinating to me to hear all your perspectives. I'm going to say thank you very much to my panel, to my audience. These guys have been great, and it's been fantastic. Thank you, guys. Thank you for listening to us.